great majority of Croatian immigrants who came to Canada before World War I and between the World Wars were men from the interior regions of Croatia. Their families were peasant families. For the most part, they were young bachelors between the ages of 21 and 40 with little formal education. Young men who left the old country, as they referred to it, to make their fortunes in the New World. They were excited at the prospect of life in Canada. Their leave-taking was mingled with excitement and expectation. The period of mass immigration took place between the wars, reaching its peak in 1928. It was during this time, particularly between 1923 and 1929, that approximately 10,000 Croatians entered Canada. Their passports indicated that they were subjects of the Kingdom of the Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs. The cost of a one-way ticket was for those times very expensive. It was the equivalent of $200 in Canadian money. It is interesting to speculate on what they must have felt upon leaving Croatia. Certainly there would have been mixed feelings. They were caught between ties with the old world and anticipation of what they would find in the new. They were leaving behind loved ones, some they would never see again. It was not uncommon for families to be separated for 8 or 9 years. Initially, many of the immigrants expected to work in Canada until they had made enough money to return home. There they would buy more land or perhaps start a small business. Many did not think they would remain in Canada. Better living conditions in Canada, together with a growing concern over political matters in Europe, encouraged them to send for their families when their finances permitted. Many of the immigrants who came as children recall the sea voyage with some sadness. The sudden break with established traditions, or more dramatically, the death of a fellow immigrant, underscored the hazards of the journey. Immigrant families often felt great uncertainties over the decision to leave a place they knew and loved for one that was untried and foreign. These same uncertainties must have beset the first wave of immigrants to arrive in Northern Ontario. Most immigrants from Croatia, with very rare exceptions, had Winnipeg as their point of destination. Winnipeg was the center for the farming labor force. It was in Winnipeg that immigrant labor, not only from Croatia, but from the Ukraine, Finland, and other European countries, arrived prior to being dispersed to farms across the prairies. Many of the early Croatians who settled in Northern Ontario left immigrant trains en route to the west. At places like Cochrane, North Bay, and Cape Real, they changed course to join friends and relatives in some of the established Croatian communities across Northern Ontario. With respect to these developments, the editor of the Croatian language newspaper in Winnipeg reported that in the spring of 1928 he was approached by the assistant to the Minister of Immigration concerning the behavior of many of the Croatian immigrants. The official complained about Croatian immigrants who registered as farmhands prior to immigration, and then once in Canada, scattered into different towns and cities, looking for work in the industries and mines. It must be remembered that it was only in the larger centres such as Sudbury and Schumacher that there were sufficient numbers of their own countrymen to alleviate their feelings of alienation in a foreign land. It was natural for them to seek the companionship of their own national group. In Northern Ontario, at any rate, they found work in the forestry industry. There was also work to be found in the mines. The gold mining community of Schumacher was once referred to as Little Zagreb, a comparison with the Croatian capital, because of the large number of Croatians who settled there. In the early days of Croatian immigration, boarding houses played an important role. For the Croat miners of Schumacher, for instance, the boarding house became the basis of a communal household. Later, many Croatian women worked in the boarding houses in return for a small wage that usually included their husband's board and their own. 16-hour days were a frequent occurrence among Croatian women in the days when boarding houses were common. Conditions in the mines were difficult, to say the least, in the early years. However, the work provided the income necessary to send money home to the old country, or to bring one's family over to the new community. New ties were established. The old ways, like the old fading military photographs of a bygone era, were slowly being replaced by a new focus on life in Canada. It was during the 1930s that 19 chapters of the seminal Croatian political movement in Canada, the Croatian Peasant Party, were founded. In 1931 in Schumacher, Kirkland Lake and Sudbury. In 1932 in Sault Ste. Marie and Thunder Bay. This political group celebrated the arrival of their exiled leader, Dr. Vlatko Maček, in Hamilton in 1946. Maček became, for many Croatians, a symbol of the continuity of their political tradition and love of freedom in North America. He became a symbol of a transplanted allegiance, one that could be cherished within the Canadian political context, if not beyond it. Representatives from Croatian halls across Northern Ontario met in Hamilton to welcome Maček. The children of Croatian immigrants enjoyed the festive ways in which leisure time was celebrated. Picnics were held frequently during the summer. Barbecued lambs provided a social and time-honored cultural tradition. As the lambs were being roasted on a spit, the children would sop bread on the lamb and enjoy a rare treat. They would sit and listen to the men as they talked about their work and socialized. They enjoyed the easy generosity of the familiar group about them. Once the Croatians had committed themselves to life in Canada, they were ready to experience something totally new, totally different in their experience. Once they gave themselves over to it, they were ready to express their identity. And nowhere was that identity more evident than in their music, their tamburica music. It revealed their spirit in the new world. It expressed their joy in arrival. The Croatian identity in Canada was expressed through music, dance, and drama. There was a time, for instance, when the Croatian settlement of Schumacher enjoyed the distinction of being one of the key centers of Croatian culture in Canada. Many refer to it as the golden age of Croatian influence in Northern Ontario. It was a high point, celebrating the full entry of an ethnic group into that favorite of Canadian images, the Canadian mosaic. This golden age extended through the 30s and the early 40s. Its influence and effects, in Schumacher at least, were felt throughout the decades that followed. Amateur theatrical groups presented Croatian drama to audiences that thrilled to see their history and heritage vividly portrayed on stage. Most of the plays were written in Croatia, but there were a number of skits and short one-act plays that were written locally. And there were concerts, with dancers in colorful costumes, all contributing to the overall cultural pattern that the Croatians were introducing within a new cultural context. The focus for these cultural events was always the Croatian Hall. It was the center, the dynamic source for their creativity. It was the meeting place for women's groups, for picnic departures, for celebrations, for events of all kinds. But perhaps it is in the Croatian picnic that we can find the clearest expression of their joy in arrival in Canada. It is here that we see most clearly the interface between the immigrant and his chosen land. The feast of barbecued lamb in the woods becomes a symbol for this interface. It marks the continuity of a central Croatian tradition, and always, always the continuity of music and dancing.